On Saturday, February 28th, the US and Israel began a direct war with Iran, targeting military infrastructure and leadership. And in the opening wave of strikes, the supreme leader of Iran was killed and assassinated by airstrikes. So this was anticipated on the podcast, and we've talked about this a lot over the past couple of months. And the timing is a stunning convergence of both long-term planetary cycles as well as a sequence of eclipses and eclipse repetitions that I'd like to cover in this video and provide an analysis of in order to give people some perspective on the astrology of this event and of the beginning of this war. All right, so first things first is long-term planetary recurrences because in late February, on February 20th, we had the Saturn-Neptune conjunction go exact, which only happens every 36 years and is a pretty rare and unique and important planetary alignment. So, as we've noted in previous episodes a year ago, my friend Nick Best and I did a whole episode on Saturn-Neptune conjunctions in history over the past 2,000 years. And we noted that these were very important in the history of Iran, especially over the past century. Most notably, one of the repetitions that's happening right now is in 1953, there was a Saturn Neptune conjunction. And in that year, the US was involved in a coup where the democratically elected government of Iran was overthrown and a new leader was installed, or the Shah was installed at that time, or reinstalled. So that was one Saturn Neptune conjunction. Then you jump forward to the next Saturn Neptune conjunction around 1989. And in that year, the supreme leader of Iran, who led the Iranian Revolution, died of natural causes. And that was the end of his reign. And then the beginning of the leadership of the current leader of Iran up until February 28th. So that brings us then to 2026 and to last week when the Supreme Leader Khamenei was assassinated by the US and Israel. And in this way, the cycle of Saturn Neptune is both repeating repetitions from the past, from 1953 and 1989, but also the cycle that was opened in 1989 with his leadership was brought to a close with this Saturn Neptune conjunction. So that's one of the major signatures that's happening right now, but there's other signatures happening as well in the background. One of them that we noted last year is that there was a Mars retrograde in Leo that was happening last year in early 2025, and this was a repetition of 1978, 1979, when the Iranian Revolution happened. Mars was in a similar position because Mars repeats its conjunctions with the sun and its retrogrades approximately every 47 years. So we were repeating the same Mars cycle from the Iranian Revolution. And then in January, especially, this culminated with a Sun Mars conjunction, which happened in what was it, January of 1979, the day that the Shah fled Iran, and the Iranian Revolution was successful, and then the Ayatollah returned and started setting up the current government of Iran and the current theocracy. And then that repeated, that same exact Sun-Mars conjunction repeated in January in Capricorn of 2026, especially centered around some of the protests that were happening then. But it also means that right now, Mars is in the exact same position that it was as the Iranian government was setting up the new government after the revolution in early 1979. So, other cycles that are happening right now, one of the specific triggers for the exact day of the attack that happened last week was there was a Mars-Uranus square, and this aspect went exact on Friday, the 27th. And so, within 24 hours of that, the war was initiated early on the 28th, as the Mars-Uranus square was still extremely close. And this is an aspect that we associate with surprise attacks and sudden violence. And in fact, the last time that we had a Mars-Uranus square was in June of 2025. And that was exactly when the first war with Iran was initiated by Israel and the US. And that was is now being called the 12-day war, but that was also a Mars-Uranus square, especially to the extent that it was like a surprise attack or a sudden attack. So it turns out, though, that there's other Mars-Uranus squares that are important in terms of the history, especially between the US and Iran. So my friend Nick and Best found a couple of them that he pointed out to me recently. One of them was the tragic Iran Air Flight 655 Airbus incident, where the US was in some sort of skirmish with some Iranian ships, and then a US ship shot a missile that shot down a civilian airliner, killing more than 100 people in this terrible tragedy that happened. That was also very close to a Mars-Uranus square. Or another instance that was more recently under a Mars-Uranus square was when Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, which was the Iran nuclear deal that the Obama administration had negotiated. And on that day, on May 8th, 2018, there was a very close Mars-Uranus square. So there's a connection and a weird repetition that's going on there because the pulling out of that deal is like part of the setup and the sequence of events that led us directly to where we are today under the Mars-Uranus square that coincided with the initiation of a full war between the US and Iran. All right, so those are some of the factors in the short term that are happening over the past few days, as well as the long-term factors. But I want to focus in particular in this video on the eclipse signature because eclipses are all over what's happening right now, and we are right in the middle of eclipse season as the war was initiated, with one eclipse taking place in Aquarius in the middle of February, and then a total lunar eclipse taking place on March 3rd, just days after the war was initiated. So, one of the things that's really important to point out that I wanted to point out that I've mentioned a few times over the past few years, but is even more stunning now, is that all three of the leaders that are involved in the current war were born on the exact day of an eclipse. So Donald Trump was born on June 14th, 1946, and this was the day of an exact lunar eclipse in the sign of Sagittarius. Benjamin Netanyahu was born October 21st, 1949, and this was the day of an exact solar eclipse in the sign of Libra. And then finally, Al Khamenei was born April 19th, 1939, and this was the day of an exact solar eclipse in the sign of Aries. So that's incredibly stunning and just statistically unlikely to have all three of these world leaders born not just close to an eclipse, but literally on the day of an eclipse. And then, of course, to have this important culmination point with all three of their lives happening during eclipse season, very near to an eclipse in the sign of Virgo, to that lunar eclipse that happened on March 3rd. And eclipses, of course, as we've talked about a lot over the past few years, have a 7-day window where the effect of the eclipse or the eclipse season begins 7 days before the eclipse and it ends 7 days after the eclipse. So we were firmly in the eclipse window, especially of that second Virgo eclipse, by the time the war was initiated on February 28th and before the eclipse went exact on March 3rd. So if that wasn't enough, we're hearing reports that the successor of the supreme leader may have been chosen, or there may be a new leader, and it hasn't been confirmed yet. But Khamenei's son is apparently, in some reports, stepping up to take over. And if that's true, there's another stunning eclipse correlation because it turns out that he was born just 3 days before a solar eclipse in the sign of Virgo. So he was reportedly born on September 8th, 1969, and that was an eclipse that happened in Virgo just 3 days after his birth. And then if he is indeed, if he becomes the leader of Iran at this point, then his rise happened just days before an eclipse in the sign of Virgo, which is the same sign of the eclipse of his birth. So, we'll be paying attention to that, and who knows in terms of whether that will be lasting or not. But I wanted to point that out because that's stunning in terms of the number of people involved in what's happening right now that were born on eclipses or born very near eclipses. And then some of the most important events in their lives are happening under eclipses, including, for example, even the death of Kamini, with him being born on an eclipse and then dying under an eclipse, goes back to some of the classic ancient things that people 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and in Persia first noticed, which is sometimes you'll see the rise or the fall of powerful people happening around the time of eclipses. And that observation from ancient times continues to be stunningly true to this day. All right. So if that wasn't enough when it comes to the eclipses, it's not just a natal signature, but all of the major steps that led up to the start of this war over the past week. And I'm recording this, I should say, on March 7th, 2026. It's 3:45 p.m. here in Denver, Colorado. And so we're still in eclipse season. We're getting towards the end of it right now as we're almost 7 days after the Virgo eclipse. But every crucial point and the way that I've been following this and some of our predictions about Iran over the past few years were based on a series of eclipses that kept happening every 6 months because eclipses only happen every 6 months and they come in pairs where there's two eclipses every 6 months and they're 2 weeks apart. And we kept seeing that um, there was tensions that were escalating in 6 month increments between Iran and Israel and the US, and that every 6 months it would take the next step towards a war, so that this eventually became part of the basis of our prediction that a major war between the US and Israel and Iran would break out soon. So let me break that down because it's incredibly important to understand as astrologers from our perspective in terms of understanding how eclipses work and how they can be used both in making observations, but as well as for predictions. So all of this goes back to a set of eclipses that began in October of 2023, where there was an eclipse in Libra followed by an eclipse in Taurus. And very near the eclipse in Libra that happened earlier that month, Hamas attacked Israel on the October 7th attacks. And that happened just days on October 7th, just days before a solar eclipse in the sign of Libra. Then later that month, the exact day of the Taurus lunar eclipse on October 28th, Israel began to invade Gaza in a ground invasion. So a lot of the eclipse series goes back to that eclipse season that was happening in October. But then what happened is every 6 months after that, things kept escalating towards the eventual war with Iran. And it started with this first repetition is when I first noticed it in some of the forecast episodes of the astrology podcast, where if you jump forward to March and April of 2024, there were eclipses that took place when the eclipse season window opened up. And during that eclipse season, Israel bombed a consulate in Syria and assassinated some high ranking Iranian generals at that time. And then, which was viewed as a major escalation because it happened at a consulate. And then, in response, Iran fired missiles directly at Israel for the first time. And in the news, this was noted as being significant because Iran had never fired missiles directly at Israel before, but instead had used typically like proxies or intermediaries or other things like that. So I noted this as important at the time because when an eclipse happens, sometimes part of the symbolism is that it's a seed moment that plants the seeds for something that looks somewhat small at first, but will grow into something large later. But oftentimes, if you notice something that's just beginning at that time, you realize if it happens near an eclipse that it actually will take on much greater importance and significance in the long term than it might seem at first. And at the time, that was what I noted was that the proxy war between Iran and Israel suddenly was starting to escalate into a direct conflict with the first firing of missiles as well as the assassination of that general. So then we jump forward 6 months later to the next eclipse season, which happened in September and October of 2024, when we had some eclipses happening in Pisces and Libra. And at that time, Israel launched the pager attack on in Lebanon against Hezbollah, where on September 17th, thousands of pagers were blown up that were being carried by different members of Hezbollah and ended up killing like a large number of people connected with that group, which was a proxy group that was connected with Iran. So at the same time, under that eclipse season, Israel invaded Lebanon and did a ground invasion. And then in retaliation, Iran once again fired missiles directly at Israel. So this was only the second time that Iran had fired missiles or drones directly at Israel, and it happened, 6 months later under the next eclipse season. So again, in the forecasts at the time, I noted this as a really important escalation because we could see that things were escalating and heading in a direction of more direct conflicts, in addition to Israel starting to hit some of the different like proxy groups that were associated with Iran. So then you jump forward to 6 months later, and this is March and April of 2025. And right on the first eclipse that happened in Virgo, the US bombed the Houthis in Yemen. And this was another proxy group that was connected with Iran and was a major first step because this is the first major military action or attack that the Trump administration took once it got into office. And at the same time, the US started moving assets into place for an attack on Iran, including moving B-2 bombers to the Diego Garcia base in the Indian Ocean, which is within striking distance of Iran. And what this did is it set the staging ground and it basically prepared for the eventual attack on Iran that would take place. And at the time, we had expected that this would be the window where we expected, based on the escalation of the eclipses, that the attack would happen around the time of that eclipse season on Iran. In addition, because the solar return chart for that year and the Aries ingress chart for Iran looked really rough. But then instead, what happened is that the US basically like attacked one of Iran's proxies in Yemen and then put or started putting the assets in place for the strike that would take place a few months later. So then we jump forward to June, and this was not an eclipse season, but it was really striking because in June, a Mars-Uranus square went into alignment, and then all of a sudden, the US and Israel launched a sudden surprise attack on Iran, especially targeting the nuclear sites and the military installations in Iran. So this was the Mars-Uranus square, and it was right after Saturn had moved into Aries, and that ended up being one of the other major triggers because we had found over the past few years that Aries is a major sign that kept coming up for Iran in different ways, both through the Aries eclipses that kept taking place there on some of these escalations, but also because the supreme leader of Iran was born with an Aries stellium and had a solar eclipse in Aries, but also Saturn in Aries. So one of the triggers for the June 2025 12-day war was that Saturn in late May had just moved into Aries, where it joined Neptune, which had also recently moved into Aries. And then this attack takes place, and the trigger ends up being the Mars-Uranus square. So that, of course, we'll see a repetition of because that's exactly what just happened in February and late February of 2026 is that Saturn just moved back into Aries recently in the past few weeks. And then a Mars-Uranus square came up, and that ended up being the trigger. And then the war officially begins just within 24 hours of that Mars-Uranus square going exact, as well as just a week after the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries going exact. And that's an important point in terms of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction because on the forecast episodes, we'd often talked about how the Saturn-Neptune conjunction that Saturn and Neptune moved into Aries last year and got really close. They got within a degree of going exact, but they didn't go exact. And that conjunction, they would retrograde apart and back into Pisces for several months in late 2025. But then the conjunction would come back into alignment, and this time it would go exact in February of 2026. And so we had sort of predicted archetypally that there was something that would almost happen last summer when this Saturn-Neptune conjunction came so close, but that it wouldn't quite happen. And then when those two planets came back into alignment in February of 2026 and went exact, the thing that almost happened the previous year would actually happen then. And that actually ended up being true in the most stunning way with this attack and with the initiation of this full-scale war between these three countries. So there's probably other instances of that when it comes to Saturn Neptune as well, indicating something that almost happened, but then fully came to fruition in February. But for now, this is one of the most striking examples of that so far. The last precursor thing I want to mention about eclipses, because there was one that went by that I didn't at the time notice fully what had happened, but it ended up being significant in retrospect. And this was the set of eclipses in September of 2025, which was the next eclipse season, like in between the March-April eclipses when the US starts moving assets into place to strike Iran and probably made the decision to attack Iran at that time, what has always been my suspicion for the past year. So there's that eclipse season in March, April, and then there's the current eclipse season in February and March of 2026. So, of course, there's an intermediate eclipse season, and that was in September of 2025. And in that month, it turns out that what happened is that three countries in Europe, the UK and France and Germany, initiated snapback sanctions, which put heavy sanctions in place in connection with the nuclear deal that had been negotiated in the previous decade. And as a result of these new sanctions, this led to a cratering of the Iranian economy. And this is what led to the collapse of the currency later in 2025 that eventually set the stage for the massive protests that happened in December and January of 2025 and January of 2026. So it turned out that that eclipse season actually was important, and there may be other things that I'm not aware of, but I think that was an important turning point was the initiation of those sanctions, and then that leads us into, of course, February and March of 2026, and the next eclipse season after that when the war officially begins. Okay, so the final point I want to make about eclipses is something I've talked about recently. I dedicated a whole video to just a couple weeks ago, which is that eclipses have historically coincided with the sudden downfall or sometimes the death or even the assassination of political leaders. And I did a whole video about this in February, just as the first eclipse had happened in Aquarius, and we were starting to see echoes of that. And also because I was anticipating what was about to happen in Iran. And so some of the historical precedents for assassinations on eclipses include Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated on a Libra eclipse in the year 1865. Martin Luther King Jr., who was assassinated near an eclipse, an Aries eclipse, in the year 1968. Even in Iran, the Prime Minister Haj Ali Razmara was assassinated on a Pisces eclipse in 1951. I want to give a shout out to my friend Nick Dagan Best, who found that one and noted it for me in a conversation recently. And then even another one we talked about in our original eclipses episode was in 1995, the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated near a Scorpio eclipse. So there's this whole string of historical leaders that have been assassinated on eclipses. And then even in more recent times in the Middle East, this pattern continues to hold, where, for example, in on January 3rd, 2020, the U.S. assassinated Qasem Soleimani, a top Iranian general, and this was a assassination or a strike that was authorized by President Trump, and this was happening in between a couple of eclipses that happened in Capricorn and Cancer, and probably would have led to a much more significant and early escalation of conflict between the US and Iran, except that was also the set of eclipses when COVID was taking off. And then the COVID pandemic hit over the course of the next month or two and kind of like preempted that spiraling into a larger conflict. But nonetheless, that assassination of that top Iranian general took place right in the middle of that eclipse season in early 2020. More recently, Israel assassinated the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, on September 27th, 2024, and this was just days after an eclipse took place in the sign of Pisces, which is one of the ones that I noted in a forecast episode back around that time as one of those like escalating steps around the time of the pager attacks. Or now all of this culminates, of course, more recently on February 28th, when we have the assassination of the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, on February 28th, 2026, just days before the Virgo lunar eclipse, which was a total lunar eclipse, which is sometimes called a blood moon eclipse, because since it's total, the moon has this red coloring over it that just looks kind of ominous and that ancient people thought was ominous and wrote about and talked about. And we can kind of see now that it's not just ominous because, the color is red and it looks like the moon is bloody, but it's like ancient people started developing this idea of leaders dying or being assassinated near eclipses because this is a pattern that actually continues to hold up in modern times, just as it did in ancient times. And we've seen this play out in the most stunning and disconcerting way today, frankly, in just the past week. All right, so in terms of where this is headed in the future, there's a few points to make for important time periods to look at in terms of Iran in particular, such as the Mars-Saturn conjunction that's coming up in April of this year, just next month, because that alignment is going to exacerbate the Saturn-Neptune conjunction and reactivate it. And then Mars-Saturn conjunctions are traditionally one of the most difficult aspects in ancient mundane astrology that astrologers talk about. So that's something we mentioned on the last forecast episode that looks like it's going to be really difficult and like an exacerbation of some of that difficult energy that's taking place right now. Additionally, in previous episodes, I talked about there's going to be a Venus retrograde in the sign of Scorpio later this year in October and November. And this showed up when I was researching the Iranian Revolution because it turns out there was a Venus retrograde in Scorpio that's a repetition of the one happening later this year that happened right in the middle of the Iranian Revolution in late 1968. That represented the point at which the Iranian Revolution the political unrest surrounding it really took off, and there was some events that happened that acted like pouring gasoline on a fire. And then from that point forward, the Shah couldn't control the Iranian Revolution, and everything spiraled out of control, so that he ended up fleeing the country in January, shortly after the Venus retrograde was over. And then the Ayatollah returns, and then the new government is created. So the fact that we're having a repetition of that same Venus retrograde later this year implies to me that there's going to be some echoes of the political unrest of 1968 that was happening prior to the Iranian Revolution that somehow are happening very much centered on especially the October-November timeframe of this year. And then in terms of the bigger picture, the more startling thing, of course, that we've been talking about for many years now, going back to 2013, is how Uranus is getting ready to go back into Gemini, and it's going to stay there for 7 years through 2033. And this represents the Uranus return of the United States, and that every time the United States experiences this transit, it ends up in one of the most important major wars in its history. And there's been three of them so far. So the first Uranus transit through Gemini around the time of the founding of the country happened during the American Revolutionary War. Then, 84 years later, the next time Uranus came back and made that return and came back to Gemini, that coincided with the American Civil War, right in the middle of the 1800s. Then, about 84 years later, Uranus goes through all the signs and it comes back to the sign of Gemini in the 1940s. And then immediately Uranus and Gemini coincides with the US getting involved in World War II and the entirety of US involvement in World War II, as well as shortly after that, the beginning of the Cold War between the US and Russia. So as of last year, Uranus first moved into Gemini in the middle of last year in mid 2025, and then it retrograded out back into Taurus for a bit. But now Uranus is going back into Gemini in April, just next month, like later in April. And we've been predicting for a while now that this would coincide with a major war with the US that's reminiscent of, but obviously bigger than some of the conflicts have been in the past three times that we've experienced this. And already we can kind of see in a way that in 2013, for example, when I first did an episode with my friend Nick Diggin Best, who had written a book about the Uranus returns of the United States and those different conflicts and turning points each time that happened. And Nick in that episode had predicted that Uranus and Gemini, going back into Gemini in 2025 and 2026, would coincide with the start of a major war. It was much harder for us back then to see the circumstances that would be put into place that could allow for something like that to happen. But now in February and in March of 2026, we can see all of those pieces moving into place much more clearly, I think. And we can see, because one of the things that this implies, unfortunately, is that even though some of the people involved in starting some of these military conflicts may think that they're doing something that will be much more short term or limited, that the Uranus return of the US implies that some of the things happening now will probably spiral out of control and escalate into much larger conflicts than some people might anticipate or plan for or hope for. So we can already see how some of those pieces are falling into place where different treaties and different alliances are activating in the same way that happened in some of the previous great wars, like World War One or World War Two. So, for example, like there's a news story out, there's a reporting out this week saying that Russia has been providing intelligence to the Iranian government for military strikes. There's also other reports saying that the Kurdish people are being mobilized and encouraged to initiate some sort of ground war in Iran. There's also the US moving all these military assets and relocating them into the Middle East has obviously created an opening where different countries, it's opening things up for different countries to do different things. So, for example, there's the close connection between Iran had been supplying drones to Russia, for example, for the Ukraine war over the past few years, or the US relocating its carriers to the Middle East. And if the US gets bogged down in a big war in Iran, which it seems like it's in the process of doing, then it may accelerate the timeline where China, there had already been reporting that China and the leader of China had asked his military to be prepared for a possible invasion of Taiwan by 2027. And if that's true, then having the US suddenly distracted and focused or getting increasingly bogged down in the Middle East and another Middle East war, it just seems like that would open the possibility of accelerating the window of opportunity where if China was going to invade Taiwan, that it would create the circumstances where that is now more likely and more possible rather than less likely or less possible. So as a result of that, I think we are seeing and we're watching in real time all of the pieces for what is going to become World War III falling into place right now. And that was the last most important, but also somewhat subtle point about this war beginning on the Mars-Uranus square is that this is the last waning Mars-Uranus hard aspect before the Mars-Uranus conjunction takes place. The first Mars-Uranus conjunction takes place in Gemini in July of 2026, just months away from now. And my friend Nick Diggin-Best and I did a whole episode on Mars-Uranus conjunctions in US history where we looked specifically at those Mars-Uranus conjunctions in Gemini because they often ended up being the pivotal turning points, especially the first couple of conjunctions for the start of the major war that would coincide with the Uranus and Gemini period and the Uranus return of the United States. So what we're looking at is that being a really important turning point in July of 2026, and that this square is somehow a precursor to that that will lead into it and will somehow contribute to what's starting today, will contribute to the important turning point in terms of the escalation or the outbreak of a more significant war in July of 2026, and then in two-year increments from that point forward, because there's going to be four conjunctions of Mars and Uranus and Gemini over the course of the next several years between now and 2033. And then it's not until 2033 that Uranus moves out of Gemini and the period of the greatest conflict should start to subside, at least in terms of the US's involvement, if the previous historical pattern continues to hold true. So that's kind of what we're looking at here when it comes to all of this. So, in conclusion, I feel, especially with the eclipse piece of this, that we're doing the same thing that the ancient Mesopotamian astrologers did. And now we can understand, in some ways, why they started to study astrology and document some of these things, especially in connection with eclipses, and that we're documenting and we're seeing in real time some of the same things that ancient peoples did when it comes to eclipses happening and like the downfall or the death or assassination of leaders, the beginning of major wars, and other historical turning points. And some of the research, I did an episode on Mesopotamian astrology last year that said that some of the earliest records when the ancient astrologers in the Middle East started writing down records of astrological omens, that some of the earliest omens that they recorded were connected with eclipses. So that eclipses were may have been one of the things that first made astrologers in the Middle East start to pay attention to the fact that astrology is this legitimate natural phenomenon that's occurring in nature, where there's this correlation between celestial movements and earthly events. Some of the first things that may have clued them into that were this weird thing that happens with eclipses where really important stuff starts taking place, especially involving powerful people. And I think we can see now why they started to make those observations and that tradition started to build and accumulate because we're seeing the same thing happen in our time with what may become one of the most important conflicts and wars of our lifetime getting started during an eclipse season. So our job as astrologers, or part of our job, there's many different ways you can use astrology, and that's one of the cool things about this field is the diversity of it and the many different ways that astrology can be used. But part of our job and part of what I try to do here is to document how the sky keeps mirroring events on Earth and how especially it keeps coinciding with these momentous historical events, and to record some of these ominous correlations and then pass this knowledge forward so that hopefully future generations might navigate some of these transits with more wisdom than what we are doing right now, frankly. And that's my hope for the future in documenting some of this stuff, even as some pretty horrible and tragic and horrific events start to take place, is to document what we learned and what we saw in our time so that hopefully future generations can benefit from it in understanding things from this perspective of astrology that we have. So that's my hope, and that's what I do, and that's what I'm going to continue to do. So, all right, I think that's it for this video, though. So, there's probably other pieces of Iranian history or other history and other astrological correlations that I've missed in this analysis. So, if you notice any other correlations that are interesting, let me know by posting a comment in the YouTube section. And that's where sometimes I like to pool all the different observations and resources so that we can, as a community, notice different things and pool different comments for the future. So let me know if you see anything interesting. And otherwise, I think that's it for this video. So thanks for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and I'll see you again next time. If you're a fan of the podcast and you want to get access to bonus content, then become a patron through my page on Patreon, where you can get early access to new episodes, attend live recordings and webinars, access the monthly electional astrology podcast, the secret astrology podcast that's only available to patrons, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. Find out more at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Isa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bazbaz, Kwatsi Alabarahu, Annie Newman, Ginger Sodlier, Berlin West, and Nikki Crawford. If you're looking for good dates to do things this year, then be sure to check out our 2026 Electional Astrology Report, which is a guide to the most fortunate dates in 2026. You can get it at theastrologypodcast.com/2026 report. If you're really looking to take your studies of astrology to the next level, then consider signing up for my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, plus live webinars and Q&A sessions each month, and at the end of the course, you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, then check out the new consultations page on the podcast website, where I have a list of astrologers I recommend for birth chart readings and other types of consultations. You can find that at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, and you can get a 15% discount on it by using the promo code AP15 at the website alabe.com. For Mac users, we recommend the program called AstroGold for Mac OS, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount at their website, which is astrogold.io. And shout out to our sponsors for this episode, including the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is happening in Seattle and being live streamed online May 21st through the 25th, 2026. Find out more information at norwac.net, as well as the United Astrology Conference, which is happening in Chicago this year, September 3rd through the 9th, 2026. Find out more information about that at uacastrology.com.